All right, so as I said, I've spent a fair amount of time organizing. We got way more questions than we're ever going to get to. But I've spent a fair amount of time organizing these questions into categories. And one of the things I'd like to do by the time we're done tonight is have this even be a resource for people to watch. So you can tell when you look at the questions, there's some people who are paying a lot of real close attention, and they're asking questions that might not make sense to somebody who's paying a little bit less. So even as we go, we might even need to stop and explain a little bit about what we're talking about. My favorite question that came there, we're going to start with some personal questions. My favorite one that came in, and I don't know how you're going to take this, but I just have to ask it. It is, who is Bart's barber?
So Bart is Bart's barber, actually.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Okay. Because first of all, it ain't that complicated, and secondly, Bart is a little cheap sometimes. So.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, tell us about your family.
Yeah. So I'm married to my wife Tracy. We met at Baylor University, but actually she went to Baylor University from Florida. Her family grew up in South Central Missouri in the Ozarks, and yet her dad got a computer degree, and it's hard in the 60s and 70s to get a computer job in the Missouri Ozarks. So through a meandering path, when she was 11, she moved from Nashville, where she was born, down to Fort Lauderdale, and they had rooms booked for her at Sanford and Baylor. And she said, I've prayed about this. I'm supposed to go to Baylor. Her dad was very skeptical, but eventually they said, if you've prayed about it, that's fine. She went to Baylor. A few weeks later, her dad got transferred to Houston when Eastern Airlines sold the Continental. And so he said, I guess you did pray about this. We met at Baylor University, and she's an amazing, godly woman. She's been a volunteer for 20 years with Southern Baptist Convention Disaster Relief. She works with Disaster Relief Child Care. Hurricane Katrina in the Astrodome, she had a facility set up just like that, ready to take in kids that were displaced from Hurricane Katrina and take care of them. She's just so much godlier than I am, an amazing woman. We have 2 kids. My son Jim is 20 years old, and my daughter Sarah is 17 years old. And we are so close to that empty nest thing that we can taste it.
All right. How did you get saved?
I was saved so early that I'm skeptical when people my age get saved in my church and really question them. I grew up in Lake City, Arkansas. I went to Bethabara Baptist Church, which was just out in the middle of cotton fields outside of Lake City. And it was a small church. I was related to almost everybody in there, and which I know in Arkansas that's sort of assumed to be true, right? But it wasn't a big enough church for us, not that I'm against these things, but it wasn't a big enough church for us to have much in the way of children's programming. So I sat in church every Sunday in the worship service, and my mom did a great job with me early on. She passed away this year. She did a great job with me early on, just sort of educating me. I remember when I went to apply for kindergarten, my mom called in the superintendent, who was my third cousin, and called in the superintendent's secretary, who was my great aunt, and said, watch this, and she had me read the newspaper for them. Okay. So I was alert and paying attention, and I was hearing grown-up preaching every Sunday morning, in the worship service, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night. And I was almost 6 years old when I became aware of my sinfulness, and I'd been hearing about God's provision for my sin for a long time. And with my mom, I knelt by a bedside and gave my heart to Christ, and I'm starting to think maybe it was real.
Okay. Well, we're rejoicing in that. That's wonderful. That's a great story. Tell us about we actually had a few questions come in specifically about this, about the process of how you became Southern Baptist Convention president. How does something like that happen?
Yeah. It's every bit as chaotic as you might think that it would be. I know that there was a time, once upon a time, when people were really organized about this sort of thing. In fact, I don't think it's a secret to anyone that here at this church, at the pastor's conference back in the day, a lot of times people who were organizing to put someone forward for president of the convention would announce at the pastor's conference, here's the person who's going to be running this year. But that kind of organization didn't really last forever. And so as we were in 2022 and we were moving toward the annual meeting, there were 3 people whose name was sort of in to be nominated for the president of the SBC, and one of them wound up withdrawing his name. And when he withdrew his name, a lot of folks that I knew said, what we have left is not a good enough selection of choices for Southern Baptists to make a choice. And a lot of friends who for several years had been saying, please, consider being nominated for president of the SBC, came to me and really pressed on me about that at that time. And I had said no for 3 or 4 years because I've got teenagers in the house. It's not a great time family-wise for me to be taking on something like that. And also, my church is, it's not a big church, and we're in a community where our community's starting to grow a little bit. And I thought my church really needs me. I don't need to be going off to do this. But this time I said yes, and I said yes to the Lord, and I said, I don't think there's any way I can win. So knowing that it's not going to cost much, I'm just going to go ahead and say yes. And he had different plans. And it's turned out I didn't have much to worry about because my church has done better without me than they ever did while I was there all the time. We baptized 25 people. That's 1/6 of our attendance on Sunday morning that we baptized last year. And so I think they're kind of worried that the presidential term is going to end and I'm going to come back and mess everything up. So I just tried to be obedient to the Lord, and he worked out all the results from it.
Okay. One question that nobody asked, but as I was reading all these questions, it seemed like it was a relevant question that's sort of in the environment of some of the questions. What is the job of the president of the Southern Baptist Convention?
Great question. It's one that not enough people ask. It's a volunteer position, first of all. In fact, I'm not going to go into detail, but I'll say it costs me money every year to be president of the Southern Baptist Convention, or has so far. But it's a volunteer position that really has only a few things that are specified in the Constitution. Baptists have always been very suspicious of concentrated power. There you go, yeah. And the more tonight goes, the more suspicious you will be of it, I'm sure. But really, it's true. It's a good thing for us as Baptists to be that way. And so we've put together an organization that deliberately has a weak presidency. The major job that I have is to moderate the business meeting that we have once a year, the SBC annual meeting, which is the world's largest open democracy. You have 15,000 people there, and any of them can walk up to a microphone and move to do anything they want to move to do and say anything they want to say, and it's amazing. Nobody else is crazy enough to do this, but Southern Baptists do, and somebody has to kind of understand parliamentary procedure with the help of people like Craig, and they have to be able to lead the meeting forward in a way that is productive and God-honoring. And that's the largest part of the job. The other part of the job is that I have to appoint some committees. The committee that counts the votes. I try not to pick too many people from Florida because I was alive in 2000. And but we have a committee of people who read ballots and count the votes. And then we have a committee that just helps register you when you come to the annual meeting, because there can be a long line of people. We want to set it up where it's painless for you to come and register as a messenger when your church sends you. But then we have 2 other committees. We have a committee that drafts resolutions for the convention to consider, and I appoint that. And then we also have a committee, and this reveals how suspicious we are of concentrated power in the Southern Baptist Convention. I appoint a committee called the Committee on Committees. How Baptist is that, right? I appoint a committee called the Committee on Committees. That committee has one 45-minute meeting, and that's all they do. And they appoint a committee that they can't fully appoint, but they have to give that to the messenger body to vote to approve the committee that they've appointed, called the Committee on Nominations. And then that committee works all year long, and they pick people to serve on the board of trustees for the International Mission Board or the North American Mission Board or Southern Baptist Theological Seminary or whatever. They have to bring those back the next year for the convention to vote on. And so I initiate a step that's before a step that's before a step that puts people into the positions of governing our entities at the Southern Baptist Convention. And those two things are almost, they're almost the sum total of the actual constitutional responsibilities of the SBC president.
Okay. This is a question that came in, and it was actually a very, very lengthy question with a lot of language around it. I won't go into all of that, except it just seems like this is a very, very heartfelt question. How can Southern Baptists do a better job of reaching liberals who hate us and our message, but who are just as lost as we once were?
Yeah, wow, what a great question. So I'll tell you this, first of all, your pastor probably knows better about that than I do, okay? I'm not the evangelism specialist for the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm just a pastor trying to reach people just like your church is. But I will say this, I think that there are a couple of things for us as individual Southern Baptists and as churches that we need to consider. One is, I think sometimes people are left wondering whether we really believe what we say. And a lot of times it's just because of the way that we live our lives. We say that we believe that everyone who hasn't received the gospel of Jesus Christ is going to spend eternity in hell, separated from God. But we'll have family members or colleagues that we love that we never even share the gospel with them to try to invite them to faith in Christ. And that's either because we're mean-spirited monsters or because we don't really think about that very often or have any deep conviction about the eternal fate of people who are lost without Christ. People hear what we say about sexual ethics, but they see us divorced, they know somebody's having an adulterous relationship who's affiliated with a church somewhere, and that makes them wonder whether we really believe what it is that we're saying. They hear us say that we believe the kind of thing I preached about this morning, about sort of turning the other cheek and listening to people who criticize you and whatever else. But then they'll see me pop off on Twitter against somebody and say, I'm just really not sure whether Bart even believes the things that he says. The fact is, the gospel is designed to work even in spite of our hypocrisies and our problems. But it works all the better when we're prepared to admit our hypocrisies and our problems and be a little more transparent for people to be able to see that we're working on it. We're work in progress, and the Holy Spirit is still forming us and working actively on our sanctification. But I really think I think the gospel works better personally than it does mass broadcast. And I don't want to say that it never works mass broadcast. I work with a guy in Senegal every year who came to faith in Christ in an animist village, although he was a part of the royal family of his tribe, because he heard the gospel presented on a radio station out of the nation of Cote d'Ivoire that was being broadcast there into Senegal. And I praise God for people. I've got family members who were saved watching Billy Graham crusade on TV. Sometimes that happens. But the fact of the matter is, most people who come to faith in Christ because somebody who knows them shares the gospel with them, And so I think a lot of times this is a self-fulfilling prophecy to look and say, well, you know, people who aren't conservative, people who are more liberal, they're just not open to the gospel. And what happens then is you meet somebody and you discover that they're liberal and you don't share the gospel with them. And so I would just say to Southern Baptists, don't say no for people to the gospel. You know? Don't say that person's never going to accept the gospel. Make people say no for themselves to the gospel. And then we'll have good data on how hard it is to reach people. I don't know that we're trying so hard that we really know how far we can go in sharing the gospel with folks like that.
All the rest of the questions are in categories that I'm sure have been your bread and butter for the last year and a half. Sexual abuse reform, politics, female pastors. So you probably, if you want to pull out your card, you probably just got all your answers memorized here. But here you go. I am personally burdened by all the revelations of scandal in the leadership of the Southern Baptist Convention. Can you please speak to the ways sexual abuse allegations were mishandled by church and denominational leaders, whether you expect more revelations to come, and how we can avoid these kind of scandals in the future?
I'm not going to take those in the order that they were given. I'm going to try to take all of them. If I miss one, let me know. Yes, I expect that there will be revelations of more scandals to come. I mean, it's 47,000 churches. I'll tell you that I am constantly talking to people at churches who are like deer in the headlights, shocked, and have just discovered that something happened at their church, and are saying, what I do? And I'm trying to direct them to people with genuine expertise to try to help them to face this. It disheartens me as well. I know people who've been hurt by this, and people who are precious to me who've been hurt by this. And I understand why you're discouraged. I do think that we need to keep in mind a couple of things that will help us to process this and understand it and respond to it. First of all, we're encountering as the Southern Baptist Convention what is a society-wide epidemic and problem. Okay? It would be, we need to look for Southern Baptist-specific solutions, and we've done that, and we're working on implementing some Southern Baptist-specific solutions. But we also need to think about what it is about our society that it produces this. I mean, take a moment and think about this. It's not just Southern Baptists. The Catholic Church has had problems of a different nature, but they've had problems related to sexual abuse. They have these problems in our public schools. We've been seeing stories about public school teachers who have been abusing students who are under their care for as long as I've been old enough to pay attention to that. And they've been working on this problem a lot longer than we have, and they're still struggling to try to fight back this predatory behavior. It's in Hollywood, it's in New York City. You have all this Jeffrey Epstein stuff that's still going on in the news. It's in Washington, D.C. The Department of Justice, who's investigating the Southern Baptist Convention, has had some sexual harassment, sexual abuse investigations internally for their organization. USA Women's Gymnastics, the USA Women's Soccer organization. Where can you go that people are not struggling with this? It's important for all of us individually to look at what we can do in our area and also to identify specific vulnerabilities that we may have. But we are never going to succeed against this until our entire society stops and takes a look at the health of our society coming out of the sexual revolution, the health of our society with the internet and the access that people have to pornography that shapes behavior. I was thinking about this several years ago, Heath. If the pastor of First Baptist Church of Farmersville, Texas, in 1924 had wanted to see some dirty pictures, or had wanted to go to some kind of a burlesque show or something like that, he'd have to get in his car and drive to Dallas and hope the police didn't raid the place and find out some kind of an assumed name and sneak in and sneak out and have a good story for where he was all day in order to go do that. Now, like all of you, our church has to pay money to a service to filter our email and our internet to keep it out. And so there are going to be more scandals, there are going to be more revelation. I feel certain that there will be. Some of that is because of the fact that we have a societal epidemic of sexual dysfunction and sexual sin and sexual abuse that's happening all around us. And another reason is because the Southern Baptist Convention, so they asked about churches and about convention leadership, I think, in there, about ways that things were mishandled. And gosh, I mean, it's Pandora's box. In some situations, the leadership of the church are the ones doing the abusing. And so in those cases, that's, how was that mishandled? In every way. I knew of a case once where it was the lead pastor's son-in-law who was in another position, a leadership position in the church, serving as staff. And that was handled not well. In some cases, what's happened is that church leaders, they were wanting to prevent abuse. They were doing everything they could to prevent abuse, or everything they knew how to do to prevent abuse. But abuse happened in their church anyway. And when they found out about it, they did the wrong thing. Some of the reason is because, I don't know, I can't speak for Heath, but I'll just tell you, for me, when I went to seminary, I got taught nothing about how to handle clergy sexual abuse or volunteer sexual abuse in the church. Because it just wasn't a subject that was on anybody's radar 30 years ago. It's not that seminaries talked about doing it and said, let's not do that. Nobody was asking them to do it at that time that I know of. And so you hit a situation like that, you hit a circumstance like that, and you may not know who to call even to ask for advice about how to handle this in your church. And so there's a generational difference here to some degree. If you grew up in the 40s and something like this happened in the 40s, people genuinely thought that the best thing you could do for the survivor was to try to limit how many people knew about this. And we know now that that's really bad advice. It's really harmful to do that sort of thing. But I understand why people thought that back then. At a time when it was before the sexual revolution, people were a whole lot more judgmental. And people blame the victim now. How much more so then? And so people did some things that they didn't realize it was going to enable that abuser to be able to abuse more and more and more people. Well, I can't be responsible for what people did when they didn't know any better, but we know better now. And so part of what we need to do is try to help churches know how to prevent abuse, and also help churches know at least this: who to call when you encounter an abuse situation in your church. Who can you pick up the phone and call to find somebody who really knows what they're doing to help your church know how to navigate a circumstance like that in a way that protects that survivor and helps them to start on the road to healing over what has happened to them. As far as the convention goes, our convention voted to have an independent investigation of the SBC Executive Committee, and by extension, the convention as well, which the convention is just a meeting that happens every year for 2 days. But then there's a corporation that sort of runs things for the SBC in between meetings, and that's the SBC Executive Committee. What that investigation found, after looking hard to see if they could find a time when the convention or the executive committee knew about abuse and failed to report it, or facilitated an abuser being able to continue to abuse, they didn't find any instances where the convention or the executive committee did that. That's the kind of thing that would lead me sometimes to say, well, the Southern Baptist Convention has never made a mistake in terms of not reporting abuse. Some people read that and they think I'm talking about 47,000 churches and saying that no church has ever made a mistake in that way. Obviously, a lot of churches have made mistakes in that way, a lot of Southern Baptist churches. But this meeting that meets 1 day, 2 days a year, once a year in June, and that corporation that helps to run it, those are not ways that those groups handled this poorly. But what was documented in that investigation, in that report, is that the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee, when survivors came to try to get the convention and the executive committee to do something to help, to try to do something to inform churches or encourage churches or provide resources for churches to do a better job, that there were times and there were people working for the Southern Baptist Convention who did not want to hear that and mistreated some of those folks who were coming and making those claims. And the convention has formally repented of the ways that we messed up there. These people, it's kind of like my sermon this morning, really, in some ways. These people were folks who really, we had an opportunity to improve quite a bit and be helped by their pointing out that we had this growing problem going on within our churches. And although we failed to do that then, now I think we're at a point where our messengers have voted twice to authorize us to go forward with sex abuse reform. And we're able to put some things together to help churches that understand who Southern Baptists are and respond to our unique vulnerabilities to sexual abuse and sexual predation.
Okay, that's good. It seems to me that denominational leaders and lawyers often disagree with victim advocates who don't always seem to have the best interest of the convention at heart. How do you know who to trust and listen to as you move forward?
Well, I'll say this first of all. I think it is in the best interest of the Southern Baptist Convention to do everything that we can to prevent sexual abuse and to take care of people who have survived it. I think that in the long term, that's the only right way to go forward. However, I think there are a lot of times, let me say two things about this, about two categories of people that you mentioned there. Lawyers and sex abuse survivors. These are all independent people who are their own people. And you can't slap a label on somebody and say sex abuse survivor, therefore I know everything you think about sex abuse and about how to prevent it and about how to solve it. It's just not true. So yeah, absolutely. There are times when different survivors disagree about exactly what we should do. There are times when different lawyers disagree about what we should do. It's probably important to go back to one of the earliest questions that you asked and say that ultimately, in the end, I have very little authority in this weak presidential role to be King Solomon, who listens to what everybody says and says, here is my ruling. This is what we're going to do. And the question seems to sort of presume that I need to know how to sort it all out and know which way to rule. But the fact of the matter is, the messenger body of the Southern Baptist Convention votes to decide what the policy of the convention is going to be. And the best way I know to move forward is, whether it's lawyers or survivors or whoever, listen to everybody and try to get them to explain to you why they think what they think, why they recommend what they recommend, and then pray about what you've heard. And pray about what you've heard in a way that cares about the gospel and about the advance of the kingdom of heaven and cares about people who have suffered terrible things in regard to sexual abuse, and in a way that cares about the health of our churches while remembering that our churches are most healthy when we can help people like that in the name of Jesus and with the truth of the gospel and the truth of healing that's found in him.
How much money have Southern Baptists spent on guidepost solutions, investigations, legal fees, task force expenses, legal settlements and other things? Do you expect that more money is yet to be spent and that the SBC is now or will be facing a financial crisis because of all of this?
That was a great question. So we spent millions of dollars. I think the Guidepost Solutions report was $5-6 million, something like that was spent by the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention. I had a friend I've known since I was a kid. God saved me when I was 5. He called me to preach when I was 11. So when I was a teenager, especially at deer season, I got a lot of opportunities to preach at small churches when pastor wanted to go hunt. And so I would get some Sundays to go, 16-year-old me, to drive out to a church somewhere and to preach. And there was a guy that I'd known since then who I grew up in Arkansas. He was pastor of a church there in Arkansas and still is today. And he sent me a letter not long after I was elected, one of the kinds of open letters that was to me and copied to several other people, in which he said, listen, we've been a part of the Southern Baptist Convention for 130 years, and we've given through the cooperative program as long as the cooperative program has existed, and we don't want any of our money going to lawyers, and we're thinking about leaving the SBC. And I wrote back to him and I said, I can promise you that there's not been a single day since 1870 that your money that you gave the Southern Baptist Convention wasn't going to lawyers in some shape, form, or another. Lawyers are not bad people. Not all lawyers are bad people. So we use lawyers to navigate the process of getting visas and things like that for missionaries to go overseas to live, to navigate legal crises that can happen with missionaries on the field. We use lawyers at Guidestone Financial Resources that provides insurance and provides retirement benefits for pastors and for churches, manages money for churches. We use lawyers there not only to manage the legal questions about all of those investments and whatever else. We use lawyers there to advocate for religious liberty. You'd be shocked at some of the ways, like with Obamacare, that Guidestone played an important role in shaping U.S. policy with regard to the limits of Obamacare. And so we have lawyers who are working to respond to sexual abuse claims and lawsuits, and that's been true as long as you've been alive. You just let that sink in. As long as you've been alive, you have spent some money on lawyers to handle liability claims and to do other things that the Southern Baptist Convention has to do. It's been more lately. There have been more lawsuits lately. There's going to be more money spent on that. Here's the important thing. I'm committed. Of course, I don't have that much to do with it, but I can tell you everybody I know is committed to spending only the amount of money on legal expenses that are required to make it possible for us to spend all the money that we spend on missions all around the world and on theological education all around the world. And that's true of your state convention. It's true of your local association. It's true of the Southern Baptist Convention. We're trying to make wise decisions to manage the amount that we're spending. But we're spending millions of dollars. Does the Southern Baptist Convention face some sort of a legal crisis or a financial crisis that's upcoming? So the decisions that we're going to face are not decisions about whether we have enough money to continue to operate. The decisions we're going to face are how to allocate our money to be able to cover the things that we need to do. The Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee is on a shoestring budget because we've always wanted to send all the money that we could to the mission boards. But the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee is also the organization that handles legal claims against the Southern Baptist Convention. Just in terms of helping the convention that only meets 2 days a year hire a lawyer and do the work needed to defend the convention, okay? And so right now we allocate very little money to the organization that handles all of that in our cooperative program budget. And yet they're handling this rising cost of litigation that really affects the entire Southern Baptist Convention. That job gets bigger for that one entity, and they're feeling the financial pinch right now. But Southern Baptists are not out of money, and Southern Baptists are not anywhere close to being out of money. We just don't send much to that entity.
Okay. When abuse happens in one church of the Southern Baptist Convention, do you think all the churches in the convention share their liability?
No. I've been so long-winded on some of the other questions. Why don't I just say no?
No kidding.
It's a yes/no
right.
question.
Okay. All right, next question.
There's a guy on Twitter who once said that I'm the only person he knows who's capable of filibustering himself. So let me give you the gift of some time back.
All right, well, no, there we go. All right, we'll be done with the sexual abuse and abuse reform questions. Few questions on social justice and politics. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with the statement on social justice in the gospel? Do you agree with this statement? Do you think the SBC should have a statement similar to it?
I'm not really familiar with it,
okay.
And that may seem to be an egregious sin. But let me tell you something. Part of the reason why is because the further I go, the more convinced I have become as a Baptist. And as Baptists, we've tended not to pick individuals and say, you sign on to things for us. Instead, our churches make decisions about what we believe. And our churches come together in a convention to make decisions about what we believe. And I had a period of time, I was a blogger back in 2006, 2007, several years subsequent to that. And man, we were really feeling our oats in the Southern Baptist internet community for a while. And we had a statement on this and a statement on that. And everybody would put up a website and get all these individuals to come and sign onto these statements. And it accomplished zero. Absolutely nothing. Because a pastor would go sign his name on that statement and never even tell his church about it. And really, in the Southern Baptist Convention, churches make decisions. That's where change happens. So people float these statements out all the time, and I just don't pay that much attention to them. But I do try to pay attention to what churches are doing. So do you know about the statement? Can you?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fill me in a little bit on it, and I'll get educated, and I'll tell you what I think about whatever it is that you say.
But you don't think that it's something that the SBC needs to focus on this year or something like that in terms of the statement?
No.
Okay.
I was on the resolutions committee for 2 years, and I chaired it one of those years. And if you want to know about what the things are that are important to me for us to make a statement on, you should look at those resolutions committee reports, and you get a pretty good idea.
All right. This fellow writes in, and he acknowledges that you are the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and he wants to know if you think Christians should support Donald Trump for president.
Thanks for keeping it with the easy questions here. So the first thing I have to say is this: the Southern Baptist Convention does not endorse candidates for office. Okay. And First Baptist Farmersville does not endorse candidates for office. I'm a private citizen, and I do sometimes. I'll vote and participate in electoral politics sometimes. And I think we all have that freedom as citizens to do that. I'm going to say this. I mean, I was asked, I did an interview on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper. That's all they wanted to talk about. It's like they wanted to talk about Donald Trump. They wanted to talk about Donald Trump a lot. And I a lot did not want to talk about Donald Trump. But they kept coming back. And so I just tell you a few things just to avoid giving you the impression that I'm too wimpy to answer difficult questions. I'll just tell you a few things. I think the 2020 election was legitimate. I think that most of the people who were saying in leadership, who were saying they had access to information to say that it was not legitimate, have come back when they had to go to court and say something and have said, yeah, well, not really. That's my personal opinion. We all have to come to our own conclusions about all of that, but I think there's a really good data-based case for concluding that. I've had a lot of elections that went not the way I wanted them to go. I voted for Donald Trump in 2020. Since that time, I'm very concerned about the way that Donald Trump has repudiated in some ways the pro-life movement in this particular campaign, saying that the reason Republicans are losing is because they've pushed this pro-life thing too far, and they're losing the people with that. And in that circumstance, here's what I think. Here's what I tried to do in that interview with Anderson Cooper. I want to own up to my own thoughts about all of this, but what I can't stand is the way that people come against folks in my church and folks in other Southern Baptist churches and act like they're hypocritical or evil or whatever else because they voted for Donald Trump in an election. There are a lot of people who have that point of view who just say, well, y'all are bad. Y'all are bad people because how could you possibly vote for this guy? And you have to look and say, look what choices we're given to choose from. I mean, it's exceedingly difficult. I try to think about everything else other than the fact that I'm going to have to cast a ballot in November, because it's very, very difficult to make these choices as believers, and I can't stand it when people don't have any sympathy at all for the plight and the difficult decisions that Christians face whenever they have to go make choices in electoral politics in the United States. So I want you to know that I can't vote for somebody who supports abortion, who supports dismembering children in these gender change surgeries. I cannot cast a ballot for anybody who's a part of any of those things. But I also recognize that on the questions that are most important to me about my faith and about affirming life and whatever else, I'm so thankful for what's been accomplished with the Dobbs decision, and Donald Trump gets a lot of credit for the appointed justices on the Supreme Court that have helped us to get to that place. But I'm really concerned about things that he said recently about the pro-life movement. And just know this, one pastor from Texas feels a lot of sympathy for the position that you're in and that I'm in for trying to figure out how we're going to vote in that election and in elections down the ballot from there all over the place.
Okay. I think by far the most questions that came in were in the category of female pastors and various amendments and that kind of thing. So there's actually, so I had to combine a lot of questions. So I think there's several questions in a row that might to some sound like the same. I think you'll probably recognize some of the nuances in the questions, but we can just talk it through as we go.
Okay.
The first question is based on a premise, so we'll check it out first. It is my understanding that the law amendment would require churches to limit the pastoral office to men in order to be part of the SBC, and that this amendment will be voted on this year.
Okay.
Is that correct?
Yeah. So you're asking me if I think that statement is correct.
Yeah. That's correct?
So I'm going to quibble with it. There is an amendment, the law amendment, actually the law Sanchez amendment that we're going to be voting on at the SBC this year, But the SBC already requires that churches limit the office of pastor to men. Without the law amendment, we removed from friendly cooperation Saddleback, maybe you've heard of them, Saddleback Church in California, Rick Warren, Fern Creek Baptist Church, Linda Popham in Louisville, Kentucky. So the fact of the matter is we already have a statement of faith, the Baptist Faith and Message, and we already have a process in place that is completely effective for doing that. So no, the law amendment does not change that. The law amendment is something that does make some changes, but it wouldn't change that.
Okay, so then the ultimate question is, do you support this amendment? Why or why not?
The most important thing for me to say is that my job is to neutrally moderate a meeting where we're going to come together and make this decision. And I think anybody who agrees with me and anybody who disagrees with me who was there in New Orleans will say that I'm fair in the way that I conduct the meeting and that everyone's going to get their say on it. I'll tell you that I'm not a fan of this amendment. And I've been, actually, it doesn't take long to search the internet to find the fact that that's true. And I've said that in spite of the fact that I completely agree with Mike Law's theology, in part because we already have a way of handling this. And you know what? That was actually a yes-no question. And you've got other questions that are down there.
You're doing great.
Okay, all right.
Go for it.
I'll keep on going then. Here's the question. When you've got somebody who's serving the Southern Baptist Church in a position that everybody recognizes to be a pastor, and the Southern Baptist Church has a woman who's serving in one of those roles, then we know what to do. And that vote was 90% to 10% in all of those cases at the Southern Baptist Convention this year. The tricky part is, what do you do when the church down the street has someone who's a children's minister, and your church has a children's minister, and that person at that church down the street does not one thing that your person doesn't do, never preaches, isn't involved in the spiritual oversight of the congregation, somebody who runs the children's ministry, and the church down the street decides to use the title children's pastor to refer to that person, and your church calls that person a children's minister. And when you go ask them about what they believe, they say, oh, we're complementarian. Complementarian means that you think that men and women have different roles that complement one another. And they'd say, this person, if our senior pastor got hit by a bus next Wednesday, we would never consider this person as someone qualified to fill that position. And in some cases, they'll say, we don't really know why we started calling that position the children's pastor. I know one guy who said, my predecessor did that, and I just hadn't fought the battle to change it, and so we've got this terminology. But in spite of the word that we're using, we're telling you that we know what the Baptist Faith and Message means when it talks about the office of pastor. It's not talking about somebody who runs the children's ministry. And for everybody who's doing what the office of pastor is in the Baptist Faith and Message, we think that person needs to be male. Did that sound extremely confusing and convoluted? Yeah, I think it is. And I think that when we face extremely confusing and convoluted questions, we ought to just let the messenger body pray about it and sort that out. We have the framework in place right now. Without any amendment, we have the framework in place right now for somebody to go to the SBC annual meeting and say, hey, this church down the road that's got a preschool pastor who's a woman, I think we need to exclude them from the Southern Baptist Convention. And we have everything in place right now for the messengers to be able to hear that question and find out the details and decide what it is that they want to do. For my part, I'm not ready to exclude a church that the reality of their structure is no different from ours. Because listen, our church is in a position where we won't use the word pastor to talk about anyone who's not in a pastoring position with regard to the whole congregation. We won't use that word to talk about anybody who's not doing that. We may have them that they do hospital visitation for the whole congregation, they preach for the whole congregation, but then they also do some work for the student ministry. But they're the student's mom and dad's pastor just as much as they're a pastor to the student. So it makes a difference in our church when we use the word pastor to talk about somebody's position at the church. It's a biblical term. And so I think the terminology is important, but I'm not prepared to look at a church that has sloppy terminology if that's all it is. It's not what it is in some churches. Some churches are actually advancing an idea that women ought to be able to take every role that a man can take in a church. But for the churches that aren't advancing that, for the churches that are just using terminology in ways that I think is sloppy, I'm not prepared to boot them out of the Southern Baptist Convention when all they would have to do to be like our church is just change a title and not change anything about the job description or role or responsibility of that person.
This next question is a long one, but it's a good follow-up, I think, to that. So I'm going to try to filter through some of the language here. I have read arguments from conservatives who are opposed to the law amendment that say we need to give space for churches who are confused, space for them to get in the right spot on this issue. But the SBC requires cooperating churches not to embrace homosexuality, racism, and sexual abuse. Why can we not say the same thing about female pastors? Should churches in the SBC have space to get in the right spot on homosexuality, racism, and sexual abuse? And if not, then why wouldn't we say the same thing about female pastors?
We already have said the same thing about female pastors. And we've consistently acted in that way with regard to female pastors. The question is, what are you going to do about a female preschool minister who's working in a church somewhere? That's the only question that's on the table, really. Because the Southern Baptist Convention, like I said, we had two churches, one big, enormous, famous, influential church, and one small church that you probably had never heard of. And we very consistently, across the board, in both of those cases, said the same thing, 90% to 10%. Not only that, but I'll tell you, in Texas, there are 2 state conventions, unlike Florida. And in Texas, one of those state conventions is newer and was formed by conservatives who were enthusiastic about the Southern Baptist Convention's conservative resurgence. Our church is affiliated with that newer, more conservative state convention. The other state convention, the older state convention, the state convention that was, at the time, not enthusiastic about the conservative resurgence in the SBC, they had a motion at their annual meeting this summer to affirm women as pastors. Now again, this is the convention that has, in many ways, down through the years, said positive things about women as pastors. They failed by quite a bit in that state convention to adopt a motion in favor of women pastors. I'm just telling you, when that state convention can't pass a resolution in favor of women pastors, we don't have a problem in the Southern Baptist Convention with people who are ready to affirm women pastors. And so I don't accept the idea that there's a dichotomy there. We're already on record about women pastors. We are consistent in the application of our belief about women pastors. And I think part of the reason why is because we've already had time to process that question, as well as homosexuality and racism and the other things that appear in Article 3 of the Southern Baptist Convention's Constitution. We've been writing and talking and debating about all of these things since at least 1980, and probably even before that. And there's been time for churches' positions to mature. But show me where the articles and book chapters and podcasts and everything are about should you use the word pastor to describe someone who's not a pastor but who's actually your preschool director. I think that's a topic that we haven't really talked about that much yet. And in fact, even the conversation around the law amendment obfuscates that question. And sometimes inadvertently so. I'm not sure it's always inadvertent. You won't talk about that question about, well, what about the preschool director? What about the person who, there's a church somewhere as a pastor of social media. And really, I'll tell you this. It's not that I think it's fine to be using the word pastor to talk about somebody who runs your social media, or to use the word pastor to talk about, y'all don't have anybody running social media called pastor here, do you? I'd check ahead of time to see if I was going to get in any trouble here with First Baptist Jacksonville. It's not that I think that's a good thing. I told somebody in a meeting not long ago that we were talking after the meeting just personally about this, and I said, look, pastor, elder, overseer, those three terms mean the same thing, and deacon, and these are biblical offices. And we've got custodians at First Baptist Farmersville, and we've got somebody who helps with the finances at First Baptist Farmersville, and we've got somebody who helps run our missions program at First Baptist Farmersville. And I think your church has the freedom to innovate in the people that you hire and the way that you organize yourself to carry out the ministries of the church. You have the freedom to do that. You don't have to answer somebody who'll come and say, well, find me a custodian in the New Testament. You don't have to have a New Testament pattern for having a custodian for your facilities, okay? But I do think that it's worthwhile not to take those biblical categories and mix the terminology up where you're confusing the things that are in the Bible with the things that we made up to help us do the work better. I think it's better for us not to blur those lines and leave people confused about it. And the reason is this: if your church doesn't have custodians, if y'all decide, hey, after church on Sunday morning, we're just going to ask everybody to pick up their own stuff and clean a little bit before you leave. If y'all decided to do that, okay, your church is not the weaker for having done that. We're not going to have custodians here. But if your church says we're not going to have pastors, then you've moved out of God's design for the church. And so because that office is important, I want to persuade churches to change and move away from using those terms in a way that blurs those distinctions. I think over the long term it's unhealthy for churches if we do that. But I'll tell you, I feel that way whether it's a man or a woman. If you have a male who's serving as your preschool director, who's not 1 Timothy qualified, and who's not functioning in this church in a way that meets what it means to be a pastor, elder, overseer, I don't think you ought to call him a pastor any more than you would call a woman in that role a pastor. I don't want to kick you out over that. I'd just like for you to listen to the point I'm making and see if it's not persuasive.
Do you think that a church who believes that female pastors are consistent with biblical teaching should be allowed to affiliate with the Southern Baptist Convention?
No, we voted on that twice this year at the SBC annual meeting, and I agree with those decisions.
Okay, a few more questions in our last few minutes. We're cruising to the end here. This is a triad of questions in one, so this person's cheating a little bit, but it'll be instructive to create a resource here for people who don't know. Okay, so the first question in the triad is, can you explain the concerns and issues behind the creation of the cooperation group?
Yeah, so the cooperation group exists to take a look at the structure of our convention. I didn't make the motion. I think a lot of people brought different concerns and issues to it. I had said before the meeting publicly that I thought something like this would be helpful. And I can articulate what my concerns were. One concern that I have is that very, very recently, we changed completely the structure of the Southern Baptist Convention, and we created a standing credentials committee. Prior to that, prior than just a few, you could not count to 10 and get past years where we've had this. It's that recent. Prior to that, the president of the convention appointed a credentials committee in the run-up to the annual meeting, and that credentials committee's job was just to handle people who would challenge and say, this church is over here bringing messengers, and they don't deserve to bring messengers because they're out of step with Southern Baptists or whatever else. And we changed that just a few years ago to impanel a standing credentials committee that a lot of people were worried could become like the Baptist Politburo, that they could look and say, we don't like something First Baptist Jacksonville did. Now, I know First Baptist Jacksonville has never sustained any criticism for anything, but imagine that somebody could go to the Southern Baptist Convention, to a sitting all year long committee, and lodge a complaint against you, and you're checked into by this committee, and they make a determination about whether you belong to the Southern Baptist Convention or not. And the way we set up that structure is that committee reports to the executive committee. 86 people out of, let's be ministerially speaking, 86 people out of 330 million Southern Baptists. Yeah, we don't have anywhere near 330 million Southern Baptists. I'm just making up numbers. So 86 people who get to decide whether your church stays in or not. Okay? And the only way it ever even gets to the messenger body to vote is if you appeal that. And I just think that's, in some ways, contrary to Baptist principles about letting the people vote on important things like that question. And I believe that the Spirit of God moves in the messenger body and helps us to make right decisions. And so what's happened is we've done something that's absolutely in the tradition of Southern Baptist life. We have governing documents that are left a little bit vague in order to leave room for the messengers to make decisions that they want to make. And so that's why Article 3 of the Southern Baptist Convention Constitution says the churches should have a faith and practice that closely identifies with the Baptist faith and message. Our Constitution explicitly says that you don't have to agree with everything in the Baptist faith and message to be a part of the Southern Baptist Convention. And we have this very vague language where nobody's told what parts you have to agree with, what parts you don't have to agree with, in order to be a church that can continue on in the Southern Baptist Convention. We can make probably some safe assumptions. If you're sprinkling babies and calling it baptism, I don't like your odds when it comes to being voted on for being a part of a Baptist convention. I unashamedly believe the Southern Baptist Convention has the right to be Baptist. And yet, that kind of vagueness, there are also some places in the Baptist faith and message that are deliberately vague. What the Baptist faith and message says about Calvinism, non-Calvinism, about soteriology, nobody would write their personal explanation of their beliefs about that with the language that's in the Baptist faith and message. It's not written to describe any actual person's beliefs about soteriology. It's written with deliberate vagueness to allow the convention to make decisions about those sorts of things, and it's facilitated cooperation between Calvinists and people who are not Calvinists for 100 years, to use that statement of faith and to say it that way. That deliberate vagueness works great when the messenger body's making decisions, but it's a nightmare when you hand it to a committee of 8 to 10 people and say, apply this, and here's a vague standard, and nobody's going to tell you what the rules are, and good luck. And you're going to make these decisions, and most of the time, the messengers will never even see these or get to vote on them at all. I don't think that is a good structure that honors the wishes of the churches of the Southern Baptist Convention. And I don't want us to become one smidgen more liberal in what we do. But with a messenger body voting 90% to 10% on these things that we voted on about women pastors, trusting the messenger bodies does not mean making the Southern Baptist Convention more liberal. The liberals left and stopped coming to our annual meeting a long time ago. And you can tell it from the way that we vote on things. So my concern that I hope the cooperation group will be able to propose solutions for, and the messengers get to vote on everything the cooperation group proposes. But I hope the cooperation group will be able to propose solutions that help us to come up with a structure that puts this in the hands of the messenger body and respects what the Southern Baptist Convention actually is. We're not like the Catholics. We're not a hierarchical structured denomination. We're a convention of cooperating churches, that it respects what the convention actually is, and it puts the decision-making authority where it belongs, in the hands of the messengers who come from our churches.
The second and third, I'll just put the second and third question, second and third in the triad here. So explain Creation Cooperative Group. Did you have any involvement with the creation of the group? And can you give us any idea of what to expect from their recommendations?
I'm the only person who had involvement in the creation of the group. The president of the convention was asked to appoint. They're not asking about the appointment. They're asking about
I think prior
the
to
idea.
Yeah.
Well, no, I said a minute ago that I had publicly said that we needed to have something like this.
Okay.
So to the degree, I didn't write the motion. I didn't have anything to do with putting up people to make the motion. But yeah, I was supportive of this idea. I think there are structural problems with the convention that are recent in origin that we ought to look at trying to get back to what worked for us for 200 years. It's not 200
And then what to
years,
expect about recommendations?
Yeah. Man, I don't know. I was required by the motion to appoint a group that was broadly representative, and I succeeded at that. And so there's diversity of opinion in the cooperation group that all is within kind of the range of who we are as Southern Baptists. But when you start talking about some of the things that we're talking about, I'll be interested to see. I will tell you this, from the work that we've done so far, I think anybody who's out here with a conspiracy theory, gaming what the cooperation group is and what they're going to do, is going to have to create a new conspiracy theory whenever they see what comes out of the cooperation group, because it's going to be different from everything. If you're a conspiracy theorist, I would encourage you to make very specific predictions about what the cooperation group is going to do, so we can decide whether you're a prophet or a false prophet. But I think people are going to be surprised by what comes out of the cooperation group, and I hope it's going to be something that unifies us. We are, because I know this is the last question.
Two more.
There are two more questions. Well, in case I don't get a chance,
Go for
I
it.
want to say that in 1925, facing the prospect of bankruptcy of some of our entities, having just come out of a global pandemic, the Spanish flu, facing terrible scandal because both the International Mission Board and the North American Mission Board had treasurers who managed to embezzle enormous amounts of money. And everybody was scandalized by what happened there. And facing theological controversy over the question of evolution. In 1925, the Southern Baptist Convention came together and adopted the cooperative program and the Baptist Faith and Message at a meeting in Memphis. And what they were able to do was to unify Southern Baptists around those things in a way that has endured for nearly a century. And I hope that what we can do, not just with the cooperation group, but with everything that we're doing right now, as we move to 2025, as we move toward the centennial anniversary of those things, is hammer out a doctrinal consensus and a reaffirmation of the idea of cooperative missions that will pacify the Southern Baptist Convention in the midst of tumultuous and fractious times, so that we're able to move forward in unity for another 100 years. Because the needs are greater now than they were in 1925. And we have much work to do.
So next to last question, two more, we're almost done. I would like you to help me understand why you appointed people to the cooperation group who support female pastors. I know that you were required to place people on the committee who were broadly representative in convention life, but it seems wrong to me to have people who do not support our denomination's beliefs to be having a crucial role in determining what role those beliefs should play in our denominational life. Please help me.
So the person everybody's talked about is a guy named Jason Paredes, who's a pastor in the DFW area, whose church has female children's ministers and preschool ministers and people in roles like that. And so I would just say, I don't think I've appointed anybody who affirms the idea that women can serve as pastors, according to what the Baptist Faith Message means by a pastor. I think they're all complementarian. You do have differences of opinion over what a preschool director can be and what she can be called, or he can be called. And I think that's representative of where we are as a convention. There are a lot of people in the Southern Baptist Convention who are committed to the idea that pastors should be men, who are not sure how that applies to a preschool director, and aren't comfortable with the idea of empowering some Southern Baptist Politburo to go kick a church out without the messengers even being able to vote, kick a church out because their preschool director was a woman. And so I think that the people who are on the cooperation group are people who, A, do not have the authority to decide what happens with the law amendment. And I tell them that regularly. Nobody can decide what happens to the law amendment other than the messengers who come to Indianapolis and vote. It will not be wrested away out of their hands because, first of all, I'm a committed Congregationalist. And I believe in our process, and everybody who knows anything about me knows that that's true. I will protect the rights of the messengers. I think the job of the president that I gave in details earlier can be summarized in this way. It's my job to protect the rights of the messengers. It's my job to answer the question of the messengers when they pose me questions. And it's my job to execute the decisions of the messengers by making sure the people who are supposed to execute it execute the things that are done. And I am committed to that, and I believe in that. And when I'm on the losing side of votes, I'd rather be in a convention where I lose, but the people get to vote, than to be in a convention where I get my way all the time. Because sometimes I'm wrong. And you've heard me for an hour tonight, and some of you know that that's true. That sometimes I'm wrong, because you've heard me say something that you didn't like somewhere along the way. And that's fine, because the fact of the matter is, I'm not the Baptist Pope. And I don't get to dictate things that we're going to do. I'm just here to make sure our processes run forward correctly. And so I think considering the fact the cooperation group is not deciding what happens with the law amendment, the messengers are going to decide what happens with the law amendment, considering the fact that I was requested to put together a group that is broadly represented, and considering the fact that it is not a 90% to 10% vote on whether the preschool director in your church can be a woman. Because of that, I think that the cooperation group is made up of people who represent Southern Baptists very well.
Your ministry context, last question, is a much different mold than most other presidents of the SBC, and I find that refreshing. How do you think your different ministry context has helped and hurt you in this job? And then the last statement, it just says, "Go Gators." So there you go.
We were doing well. Actually, I don't know that I have any dog in the hunt with regard to the Gators or whatever else. Let me just disappoint you all right off the end of the thing here and just make you all mad. I really don't care about football at all. I am a baseball fan, and because I am a Christian, I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan. And so let me explain. Because I'm a Christian, I believe that I'm going to go to heaven, and I would have to explain to my grandpa if I were anything other than a Cardinals fan over the course of my life. So I don't want to have that conversation. And then the other thing that I can say is that this isn't even in the question, but I don't like coffee. So let me just go ahead and offend everybody with a couple of statements. I want to say this. I get real nervous when people ask me this question, although this may seem like a softball question, because it would be so easy to answer this question in a way that sounded like I did not appreciate pastors of large churches in the Southern Baptist Convention. And nothing could be further from the truth. Our convention has been served well in the presidency by people who pastored large churches. There's not a week that goes by that I don't ask myself, what would Adrian Rogers do in this circumstance? And I picked Adrian Rogers. I know you had Jerry Vines was here and whatever. I picked Adrian Rogers because I grew up 60 miles away from Memphis. And he was an oversized influence in that part of the world in my upbringing. So I'm just nervous about questions that say, how is it that you're different because you're not a megachurch pastor or whatever else? I don't know. I think the best thing for the Southern Baptist Convention is for him to be someone who loves Jesus a lot and loves Southern Baptist churches a lot and has a deep and abiding faith and won't quit. And I think those things are really valuable qualifications for people who are going to serve in this way. I do think that I want to highlight something that I think is different about me as president that's not true for every president, that is related to serving in smaller churches, but not exclusively there. When it comes to that big job that I said I have, moderating that big business meeting, we have congregational business meetings every month at our little church in Farmersville and have all the time that I've been there, and every other church I've ever served at has had monthly business meetings, and so I do that all the time. But then the other thing, actually, that's something that's held in common by Al Gage, who's been the chief parliamentarian of the Southern Baptist Convention, and by me. We both learned parliamentary procedure at the same place, the Future Farmers of America. I believe in the future of farming with faith born not of words but of deeds, achievements of past, well, I'm not going to do the entire FFA creed, okay. But I'll tell you that I was in FFA, and it's really underappreciated as a leadership training organization in schools because in FFA, I competed in prepared public speaking and went to state. Now, it was the state of Arkansas, and they have 4 times more people in Dallas than they have the whole state of Arkansas. But I went to state in prepared public speaking. They have extemporaneous public speaking, and they have parliamentary procedure as a competitive event in FFA. And that was something I loved and got into. And so I will say that I think sometimes we've had presidents of the SBC who, it'd been a while since they had conducted a business meeting, and they really needed the help of the parliamentarian maybe more than I need in that. And being in small churches that tend more to have more frequent business meetings and more participatory business meetings probably makes some difference in that.
You have served us very well today. We're very, very thankful for you and your time with us. Could I ask you to serve us once more by praying for us as we conclude?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do that. Father, thank you for a delightful day here with First Baptist Church of Jacksonville, Florida. Thank you for the storied history of this church and for the things that you're at work in their midst to do today. And I thank you for Heath and for the invitation that he's graciously given to me and for the hospitality that they've shown today. Thank you for the Southern Baptist Convention. Alongside the fact that we field a lot of missionaries, do what we do in disaster relief when a hurricane blows into Florida, do what we do in terms of theological education. Alongside all of those other things, I'm thankful for the Southern Baptist Convention because it's one of the only things that makes an independent, autonomous church like First Baptist Farmersville give a rip about what's happening at any other church anywhere else. And I think it's a blessing that you have given us an opportunity to kind of get out of ourselves a little bit and be a part of a family of churches where we care about each other. And so, Lord, although I'm not a member here, and I'm from far, far away, and today's the first time I ever set foot on this campus, I just want to say that I love First Baptist Jacksonville. I want you to reign here in a way that you do good things for a community and a state that needs to know about you. And I just pray that your Spirit would move powerfully among this church's leadership and membership, and that you would lead us, not just this congregation, that you'd lead this congregation, but that would trickle up into everything that we're doing in state conventions and national SBC work in a way that we do what is righteous and holy and evangelistic and powerful and good for your glory and for the sake of your kingdom. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.